supposed to be a booster. Don't be crushed like a rooster. You're supposed to be a booster. Boosters are Bible school. When we study the book of Joshua and then in the book of Judges, we see some events that are taking place that are instructive to our generation today and will always be important for us as we learn Bible principles from the Old Testament. And we see that with people being oppressed, people being cowardly, people following things other than God because of the culture around them. So I want us to see this in the light not only just to Old Testament times when these times were very difficult, especially for the 300 plus years that people were under judgeship of the judges, and we'll talk about what that means. But in the first paragraph, we begin to observe that the events that happened at the end of Joshua's life is kind of very instructive. Because as long as Joshua lived and the people followed the teachings of God, things were fine. What about those after Joshua died? What about the immediate time and after Joshua died, the elders that still lived, were the people following God? Yes, they were. Yes, they were. And I think that's very important to understand that there was still that influence as we come at the end of Joshua, where we observe the events taking place before the time of the judges. Joshua 24:31, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and add the Bible to it now, because we think about, well, they just went off after Joshua. No, not quite. We're looking at the details, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had known the works of the Lord. They had experienced what Joshua experienced. They began to have the faith in God, and as long as they lived, they still were leading the people. Joshua's dead, but his legacy kind of lived on there. But these men had experienced that as well. But what happens in Judges 2? We go to the book of Judges. And when the generation who profited from Joshua's leadership died, a new generation arose, and that's the point that you were making when you said, well, they left the Lord. They did, didn't they? But it was a new generation that did not have the influence. I know your young children, what's the word influence mean? We know what influence means. That relationship with them that leads them into the right way as far as God is concerned. They didn't even know the Lord. Especially, they didn't know firsthand of his miraculous works, no firsthand of what godliness meant. They just get out of their minds. That's a generation that goes the wrong way. So what are you doing, or what are we doing together and having this summer Bible study? That's what it is. Vacation time from school and all of that. What are we doing? We're trying to let the next generation, your children, grandchildren, children in our churches, we're trying to get them, you got to know the Lord. And when we die off, when we leave this earth, there will be that grounding that Jehovah is still living. He's still ruling, and we want to know Jehovah. So what are we doing? We're learning stories. What do they create in us? Samson is enlisted in Hebrews 11 in the sense of stopping the mouths of lions, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Men of faith, he had faith in God. He wasn't the greatest character. He had a lot of shortcomings, but he would be serving God and in a special capacity that God is letting them understand undeniably. In this story we're going to see today, your children are going to learn, it had to be from God. Take a jawbone of a donkey and kill 1,000 men.
I can't imagine 50. Can't imagine 100. How does one do that feat? It's because God's sending a message through a servant who was Samson. So what had happened is that they left the Lord. So what does God do? God doesn't, take this lying down. But our first question, how did the spirit of compromise lead to the pain of God's people who are going to be under the rule of the nations about them, especially in the times of the judges, before the kings came? What was a spirit of compromise? Because that's what happened, didn't it? Turn with me to Deuteronomy, the 7th chapter, and verses 7 through 11. I mean, we're not going to take all the details, but I want us to see there were the nations. He said 7 nations still in the promised land that belongs to us, Israelites. What were they to do? They were to wipe them out. They were to take them out of their land. They didn't do that. And Jehovah had warned the people through his leaders to Israel that they were not, in verse 2, make no covenant, have no mercy with them, and make no marriages with them, because their daughters are going to take your sons off into what? Idolatry. That's where they're going. It's interesting how the influence of a woman can take your boys away from the Lord. It happens. And part of Samson's giving in to things, what he does through the influence of a woman. And they can have that influence, and the people had that. The culture around them, they were involved in idolatry. And as we'll see that if we read Samson from chapter 13 on in Judges, you'll realize that the people were involved in serving the idols and practicing idolatry. And what God would do, he would bring the enemy in the land that they did not drive out. They're still there. And indeed, they would conquer the people, and they would be under their oppression, under their rule for a number of years. Kind of the number that keeps coming up a lot of times is 40 years. We'll come back to that later. But 40 years, the Philistines have had their way with the Israelites. But something happens, and God's going to bring a deliverer. So we're back here. How did that start? It started with a spirit of compromise. Because in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 7, for he will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods, so will the anger of Jehovah be kindled against you, and he will do what to you, Israelites, very quickly? He'll destroy you. And they're doing it. But then they would cry out for mercy, and then God would deliver them. But I want us to notice in verse 9 how we can overcome that. Know therefore that Jehovah thy God, he is God, as faithful. He keeps covenant and loving kindness with them that love him and keep his commandments to how many generations? 1,000. That's what we're going to keep going. How do we show love to God? We keep his commandments. How do we increase our faith? He's faithful. And he's the one that is delivering them. And they go good for a while. But he has the ability to be faithful, and it shows 1,000 generations. We can instill the faithfulness of God in our hearts of our children when they're young. They can know God. They know the Old Testament, they know the New Testament, and that's what we do. We teach the Word in these schools. It's not just play. We try to make it fun and exciting for them, but at the same time, they're learning these things that will help them, and you're attributing to that, and that speaks well of you. But what happens is that do we compromise with the culture around us? Is it a battle you have to fight? Television, social media, you make the rules in your house of how much time and what you look at, and be protecting of that they don't get into areas where they shouldn't be, and that's so available, isn't it, in the social media. So you draw them close to God, and you don't have the spirit of compromise. I mean, they were to make no covenants with them, not going to enter marriage with them, and they show no mercy to them. And we're to be merciful people in the culture we live in, but there's a sense of error and that which takes people away from God. No mercy, no covenants, no marriage with them, and they were to drive them out. Well, they didn't do that exactly. And so they're here, and the influence comes, and they're in pain, and they will cry out to God, and God would deliver them. God would deliver them. Question 2. Samson is a good example to show that judges were really blank. They were deliverers. Now, Exodus 18, verses 21 through 26, you deal with men who are judges in Israel. Moses was to establish that because he took too much on himself, too much that he could handle. So he would bring forth men that reverence God, that hate unjust gain. So they're not going to be out for a bribe. They're going to do what is right in Exodus 18, 21 through 26. And they had an early arrangement. They had men over 1,000, 100, 50, right on down to 10. Anything more than 10 goes to 50 men. Anything more than 50 goes to 100 men. Goes to 1,000 men. And if anything was too complicated for them, they went to Moses, who would stand before God. Orderly. And they would judge according to the laws that were in place to deal with matters of, well, you cheated me out of that donkey. You cheated me out of this. I don't think you own that land. I'm supposed to own that land. They would deal with those things. And so we come to these judges. We think Samson was a judge like that? No, he was a deliverer. Look at Judges 2 and verse 18. So we open the book of Judges. We see the problems taking place. We see now deliverers setting forth. But in verse 18 of Judges 2, when Jehovah raised them up judges, then Jehovah was with the judge and saved them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. My Bible says, for it repented Jehovah because they're groaning by reason that they oppressed them and vexed them. Now Jehovah repented. He changed his mind. The Philistines are not going to have rule over you. Why? Because God hears their cries. He hears their moanings. They're people that are vexed, and he's been teaching them a lesson. So what does he do as a good father? He has mercy on them. And they would do good for a while, as long as the judge was living. But what got them to respect the judge, that they were going to follow God? He wasn't a lawyer. He was a deliverer. What kept them united? Because what they would see would be one that's confirmed by God in a very special way. Is that going to be Samson in our story today? He killed how many men? What, did he have a bomb? Jawbone of a donkey live? A dead donkey. Now he did have a fresh donkey bone. It wasn't brittle. But he's going to kill 1,000 men with that. And is that a hyperbole? Well, is it a hyperbole for 3,000 men of Judah to come down and say, we're going to deliver you up, Samson? Was that a hyperbole? That's 3,000. I think it's very literal. Just like the 3,000 are literal. That we read it in the same text that deals with Samson. So, literally, 1,000 men. And we men can think about that. And what weapon would you have? And was it one that he was planning to use? He saw it lying down. It was a fresh one. So it wasn't all brittled up and lost all its moisture or anything like that. But he used that, and that had to be put in hand and didn't have the strength and the ability and the power to kill 1,000 men. Who is behind that? Not anyone but God. Samson, you're a judge. He only went 20 years before he started bringing things to an end on himself. But when Samson comes on the scene, how long have the people been under the judgeship of the Philistines? And we're there 40 years. And that's what we see it open up. So, idea of judges, they didn't get a law degree, and they know all the laws of the Moses dealing with relationships to one another. They were ones that are going to deliver the people out of oppressive rule. That's for warlike people. They're going to do that. And then as long as the one was there, and Joshua and people connected with him, the elders, they had an influence for a while, but then the judges come along. Phinehas, Ehud. They will come along and deliver the people and bring them back, and for a while they'll be faithful, and then they would go back to the culture around them. What does that tell us about why we need weekly reminders of the Lord's death, who died for us? Why we need to not forsake or turn away from, completely leave out our coming together and worship. We need that. That keeps us strong. We are exhorting one another. We're encouraging one another. That's why it's important that we assemble. What happened during COVID? And when people were trying to not spread death, and we didn't know what exactly things were. Services were canceled. You can live stream it, maybe. But that's not the same being there. Virtual reality is not reality. And there's a sense that God said, not only to coming together to take the Lord's Supper, we proclaim the Lord's death together. There's something about being together, singing to one another in the presence of one another. That coming together is very important. Did we see that for public schools? Did that harm to kids that were not able to be together, or when they were together, had their faces with masks and they could not see their eyes or see their voice? Or you saw that if you came, some of the schools came together like that. We are affected by that, and we're encouraged by that, and we get discouraged when we're not together. God, in His wisdom, has set this where we, in our generation, we can be faithful to our worship services, engaged in every facet of it, engaged in trying to be an encouragement to everybody that we come in contact with in our local churches. And it becomes important to keep the people together, because we start compromising, we start falling away from what we need to do, we can find ourselves in need of a deliverer. And we don't have a judge come along and kill off 1,000 enemies, and all of a sudden, woof, that got our attention. We have Jesus, and He's faithful to us. We need to be faithful to Him. Before the event with the jawbone of a donkey, how did Samson manifest his strength and wit? I want to just back up a little bit. Who was the father of Samson? You remember his name? Manoah. An angel of God met his wife first and talked about what events would happen, and that have a son, and he would not allow a razor to touch his head, not to drink wine, anything like that, because he would be a Nazirite, totally dedicated to God. And a lot of times that was done for a special time, for a duration of time, they'd have their hair cut. But he wasn't to have that because he was a Nazirite. He comes again, and Manoah said, what did you do with my wife? And the angel of Jehovah is interesting. I'm saying the same thing to you that I told your wife. We're not hiding anything from you, Manoah. He said the same thing about Samson. But the thing about Manoah, he says, how shall we order that child? Chapter 13, how shall we order that child? He's going to be special. An angel of Jehovah has come, and we've seen God, and we're not dead yet. And the miraculous thing about that, they would offer up their sacrifices. The angel went up into the flame of the fire, up into heaven. How do you like to be standing around after that one? I think that was God. We're going to die. No, she said, he accepted our sacrifice. Angel Hope went up there. He didn't burn up. He just went up there. Samson was special. They knew it. How shall we order him? So that's behind the scenes there. So here comes Samson, and he finds a Philistine girl he'd like to have for his wife, and says, get me that one. Well, that's not real good choosing out a wife like that, but that's what he did. And the things lead up to the fact that one day he shows his strength. He doesn't tell his parents. But while he's traveling from Herod to go to his father's house, there's a young lion that springs up. What did he do with that young lion? Just rent him asunder. And so what happened after that was kind of instructive, because it showed what? Great strength to do that with your hands. But he had a little riddle to go along with it. Did he have some wit and some that part of him? And so there was a challenge as a feast was taking place for 7 days, and they had 7 days to answer this riddle. And verse 14 of chapter 14, out of the eater came forth food. When Samson comes back and sees the carcass of that lion that he killed day before, he comes back, and what's inside the carcass of that lion? Your bees and honey. And out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not figure that out in the 3 days to declare the riddle. How long did it take you to figure it out? What's the big deal? It is honey coming out of the carcass of a lion. What's the problem with that? They couldn't get it. And wonder if you didn't know the back end of that story. Would you figure that one out? Out of the mouth of the eater came forth food. Might be thinking about a person. But it was a lion, and he was strong. But who was stronger that day? Well, Samson was the servant, but God was the strength. And he's being made aware of that. Either with the idea, I can take on that young lion. I'd be trying to run away, and we might do that. But they couldn't figure that out. And when it came to pass on the 7th day, they said unto Samson's wife, entice thy husband that he may declare unto us the riddle. So ladies, what did she do? What do you do when you want sympathy? Cry. It works, doesn't it, sometimes? Oh, if you loved me, you would tell me that. He hadn't told his parents yet. If you love me, so what happens if I don't tell you? You don't love me. And God and her father gets a hold of that, and before it's all over, she gives the best man to her as a husband, because Samson didn't love her enough. Now, all of these things are coming together, but they did not know that God had already determined that he's going to bring the Philistines down. And so I want us to think about the things that we see in these chapters, is the fact that God had already determined when these things are going to occurring to bring about the situation. So there is that relationship with his wife. All of a sudden, it's going to turn out that Samson is going to put 300 foxes together and burn up their fields. It's going to lead to one thing after another, revenge and all of this sort of thing. God brings these things together, and it's not miraculous. I mean, this is the idea, you don't love me enough, and you tell me the riddle of tell me the solution of that, and it's just back and forth. But it was God's way, how he brings about in his providence, how he brings down and brings forth his plans. It's just amazing to me to see that taking place. But he is already determined, and people didn't know that, and bringing these things about. And so it happens that way. So there was a sense of his wit and his strength in bringing down that bringing down that line. Any questions you might have for that? All right, question, that's number 3. Trying to see if there's anything else that Judges 13:13 says, the angel of Jehovah said unto Manoah, of all that I said unto the woman, let her beware, she may eat of nothing that cometh of the vine, so forth, that all that I commanded thee, let her observe. So you're going to order the child this way, but he's going to bring these events together. And he does that real well. And the Spirit Jehovah is going to be upon Samson as well. And we'll talk more about that. What was the underlying purpose? Question 4. What was the underlying purpose in his spirit coming mightily upon his servant Samson? And we see this a number of times in the life of Samson. And we may look at like chapter 13:25. The Spirit of Jehovah began to move him in Mahaiadan, between Zorah and Eschatal. And so he went down to see a woman, and that's where he gets with this woman, and that's where this riddle comes because of the lion. So the Spirit of Jehovah began to move upon him, and he had that power then to be able to fight the lion. Chapter 14 and verse 6, the Spirit of Jehovah came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, a goat. Young one, and he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his father, his mother, what he had done. And it's going to happen in our story as well. Chapter 14, verse 19, the Spirit of Jehovah came mightily upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and smote 30 men of them, and took their spoil, and gave the changes of raiment unto them that declared the riddle. He had to go get the clothing, change of garment, 30 piece of garment, and the change of garment. He had to go get that. He didn't have that in his closet. So what did he do? He goes down and kills 30 men. Spirit of Jehovah's on him. There's a power that's there moving him, and all the events taking place. Well, she betrayed me and I had to do this. 15 and verse 1, it came to pass after a while in the time of the wheat harvest that Samson visited his wife with a kid and said, I will go into my wife in the chamber. But her father would not suffer him to do so. Her father said, verily I thought that thou hast utterly hated her. I told you the word got to him. Daddy's going to take care of things. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Her younger sister, a little prettier. Won't you take her? And Samson said, this time shall I be blameless. So I'm going to get revenge now. So how things are unfolding. There's the 300 foxes. To me, is that a hyperbole? I can't catch one fox. He ties 2 together. Lights their tail. He sends them through there. Well, what happens? Verse 5, when he has set the brands on fire and let them go in the standing grain, the Philistines, and also the olive yards, then the Philistines said, who had done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timonites. So they're related in marriage. And what happens to the father and Samson's wife on that occasion? The Philistines burned them to death. They have revenge. How things unfold? And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. And Samson said unto them, if you do after this manner, surely I will be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh. What does your translation say? Verse 8. Different translations say that, but let's get the concept. Yes, sir.
With a great slaughter, which I think is a lot better.
But not necessarily. You say that. I'm not disagreeing. But the hip and thigh, the word hip can be leg. If you're in a wrestling match and you have the leg upon that person, you've no mercy, you conquered them. And that was the proverbial saying of that phrase. I think that's interesting to know before we go to a better translation. But the point that you're making, you surely defeated them. The leg over the hip. He's down. Match over. That was the thought in the days of the Bible that showed no mercy complete defeat, and he did that with them. And he uses that phrase to set forth the fact he smote them hip and thigh, great slaughter, totally defeated, because it's a wrestling concept that they had in the Hebrew language. And he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock in Etham. And so they go up, and as we see in verse 9, this is where in verse 11, how many men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock to get him? 3,000. 3,000 men. Oh, that's a hyperbole too. Why? Why would you think that? Well, don't need that many men. They're not that fearful, are they? They're fearful of Samson. And they're going to make sure he's going to be taken to the Philistines. He is the problem, not their compromise with God. That's the way it is. You get rid of Samson. But you know what? Samson's pretty mighty powerful. So what do we need to go get him? I think we need 3,000 men. And so that's what happened. So the Spirit moves mightily upon them. God's underlying purpose, his Spirit, was that he's going to, this man of strength is going to be the deliverer from the Philistines. And that's exactly what happened. How does Samson's trust in God manifest itself in the event of the jawbone of the donkey? So let's come back to our text. Verse 14 of chapter 15. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him. So the Philistines, why are they now shouting in? You do that when you go to war, in battle. Why were they shouting at that time? Did they think they had Samson? And what had just happened to Samson? The 3,000 deliver him up. In verse 13, they bound him with two, not one, with two new ropes. That'll get it, won't it? We don't want anything falling apart. Two new ropes, and brought him from the rock. And the Philistines said, we got him. Who betrayed him? People of Judah. The people, no people. Because he was the problem, not their ungodliness. Great lesson that. Life repeats itself that way too. But the Spirit of Jehovah came mightily upon him, and what happened to those ropes? Now, how does he describe it? It was like they came loose, they melted off of him, because what's the imagery? It's like he was wrapped around and like flax that's just melting with the fire. That's what it was like. These are two new ropes. They're like burning flax that just melted off of him. And so what does he do? He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and put forth his hand and took it. Now we have a picture out here in the foyer. His eyes are looking down, and what is his hand going for? Jawbone of a donkey. And with it, he smote 1,000 men therewith. I take the book literally until it's impossible to believe otherwise. Why can I believe this? Because God does impossible things with us. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, bodies upon bodies. With the jawbone of a donkey have I smitten 1,000 men. Oh, you're just exaggerating, Samson. No, he did that. He did that. And it came to pass when he had an end of speaking, we find that he was a little thirsty. Wouldn't you be? In fighting that battle. Now, when we see this happening, I wanted to know how long they had been under the oppression of the Philistines, and we saw earlier that it was 40 years. How depressed can you get in 40 years of something that's not changing? Especially who's ruling over you. What do we have in our country? We can, every 2 years, have an election. You got the Senate, and senators every 6 years. They kind of go, maybe a longer, but every 2 years we're having an election. How long does our president serve as a president? 4 years. And you and I get depressed because our guy didn't get in, or our person didn't get elected, or things are happening the way they are. Now, they can accumulate over decades and decades because people are ruling and they don't care about the people. We understand all of that. But can you sympathize with the people a little bit that it doesn't seem things are changing too much in my decade of living? No, my 2 decades. No, my 3 decades of living. No, 4. It just doesn't change. Could you see why they want to get rid of Samson? He's the problem with the Philistines. Get rid of him, and they'll be happy with us. Because we'll still be under what? Their rule. And God said, I'm bringing them down. And Samson's going to be the man. But can you see why they have a defeatist attitude? Verse 11, 3,000 men went down to the cleft of the rock, chapter 15. Samson, knowest not that the Philistines are rulers over us? When did you get that mindset? 40 years. Not just 8 years of a president we don't like. Or we like those and we didn't, we thought it was great, now it's changed. 4 years of this one. What happens? We don't like it. But they understood that indeed that the Philistines are ruler over us. There doesn't seem to be any change in that. Then this is that thou hast done unto us? Samson, you're the problem. You're causing us to have problems with them. And he said, as they did unto me, so I've done unto them. There's his vengeful spirit. There's God working through Samson. They did this to me. They burnt my wife. They did all that. I'm getting even. God's using them. And he was doing this, and these are indeed the deliverers. But I can see how people can have a defeatist attitude. We get defeated if we got a different leadership for 4 years or 6 years. And it can cause you to have a mindset that we'll never be out of this. And we need to realize we can change things. Things can change. And God changes things. And he is behind. He brings nations down. He brings nations up. And we just got to keep our faith with the Word of God and make sure we don't get caught up in society with the evils that happen and don't get oppressed what's happening, because God is in control. He may be teaching us some lessons. He may bring in the end of nations. I don't know, but we're going to be okay with God, and that's the way we should have that. So after this, we find that he was thirsty. So God had already provided him water when he got through killing the 1,000, right? Well, let's ask Samson. What does Samson say? Verse 18, he called on Jehovah and said, thou hast given this great deliverance by the hand of thy servant. He knew who was the power behind what he did. But he was one that's going to set forth the energy and have the energy as he keeps killing the 1,000. And I shall die for thirst. No, here's the bottle of water right here. It's not there yet. It wasn't there. I fall in the hand of the uncircumcised. This was something that bothered him. Remember when they are going to capture him and he wanted them to give a promise that they would not turn him over there to be killed? He said, we are come down to bind thee. And Samson said unto them, swear unto me that ye will not fall upon me yourselves. You're not going to kill me. Promise me that. Because he's going to take care of the Philistines. But he said, I don't want you to. No, we're going to tie you up. And so that's what happened. So now he said, I'm going to die. Does it sound like a man had a puddle around here, some water? It wasn't, he didn't see it. So what did God do? He clave the hollow place that it's in Lehi, and there came water thereout. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived. He revived. And so we find that is indeed the spring of him that called. That what that Hebrew word means. So a spring comes out of the cleft of a rock. How convenient. God has brought water out of rock before, hasn't he? So what does that tell us about God knows our needs before we ask? Matthew, we see Sermon on the Mount. Don't be like the Gentiles. But we are to have faith, and we're to ask and seek that God will provide. Have you ever gotten to the point, I think about this sometime, if God's going to destroy the nation, why won't we quit praying for the leaders? You get depressed or something like that, it's going to do what he's going to do. And that there's really no changes. Prayer's powerful. And what God says, you may have a need, but why does he want us to express that? That's what he did to Samson. Samson had to express it. God knew he's thirsty, and God will provide that. But after Samson wanted it. And I think about that with prayer, that I need to express, because God has told me to pray for the nation, the leaders, that we'll live a peaceful life, that we're doing what we're doing now without people coming and taking us away. Want that to continue? Well, it's going to continue, it's not going to continue. It's all be up to God. We can pray for that. Let our wishes be known, because that is expressing what in our relationship with God? Faith. We trust you, God. And we feel like I don't know where we're going to get the answer, but I trust you. And you can let your requests be made known unto God. And we've got to keep doing that. And I think that's a marvelous lesson we see from Samson, as well as talking about prayer. And question number 7, how does faith in our Lord overcome all enemies of righteousness today? And that's kind of what I'm looking at here, that you seem like maybe the crowd, like Joshua and Caleb, for example. How many spies went down there to spy out that land? The land of Canaan that now they're in there trying to keep it as a promised land for the Jews. It has land of plenty. We got the grapes to prove it, bringing it back on our shoulders. We know that, but we can't. We look. There's the discouragement. We look as grasshoppers like them, and so 10 of them gave an evil report, meaning we can't do it. It made Joshua and Caleb mad. Rent their clothes. And the point is, what it takes individuals like you, like me, standing up where we are in our realm of opportunities and influence, and just be the servant of God and be one. God can make changes. He makes changes one at a time. Make changes one at a time in our families, our people we're trying to reach with the gospel. And God has the power to do that, and he wants us to request that. But when we think, well, the culture is going to dogs and there's no more hope or anything like that, thank you, then I feel like I got 9 more minutes, so I'm going to keep going. The things will happen that it can change, and we prayed for that. And I think we've got to keep doing that. What is Philippians 4:13? That's a passage. Everybody knows that passage. What did Paul say? The time of plenty, or time when he didn't have anything. He knew how to deal with those circumstances. He knew how to be content. He can do all things through whom? Through God. I can do all things in him that strengtheneth me. Who's strengthening Samson? God Almighty. It wasn't any jawbone. I don't care how fresh it was. That's just an instrument. And what did he do after that? He threw it away. I'd put it in a museum. But he just tossed it away. It's just an instrument. And he says, you work through me. He knew that. He's known it since he killed a lion. He knew he knew that the Spirit was upon him, and he was a servant of God, even though his character had a lot to measure up to as far as being totally godly, as it should. But we can defeat the enemies around. Maybe just our sharp spirits of life around us. We can seek for righteousness and ask God to help us to overcome those as well. So, any comments or that you'd like to add to our discussion today about Samson? To Jesus Christ, a faithful follower, I will always be. To Jesus Christ, a faithful follower, I will always be. To Jesus Christ, a faithful follower, I will always be, 'cause He is my best friend. I have Jesus as a friend, thank the Lord, thank the Lord. I have Jesus as a friend, thank the Lord, thank the Lord. I have Jesus as a friend, I have Jesus as a friend, I have Jesus as a friend. I'll thank Him now. I will sing of Israel's judges, Israel's judges, Israel's judges. I will sing of Israel's judges, there were 17 in all. First of Gideon, then Ehud, and Shamgar, and Deborah, then Gideon, and Abimelech, whom the people made a king. Then Tola, and Jahar, and Jephthah, and Ibzan, and Elon, and Abdon, and
Samson the strong.
Then Eli, and Samuel, and Joel, and Abijah. I will sing of Israel's judges, there were 17 in all. I have the joy, 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 joy down in my heart, down in my heart, down in my heart. I have the joy, 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 joy down in my heart, down in my heart to stay. I have the love of Jesus down in my heart, down in my heart, down in my heart. I have the love of Jesus down in my heart, down in my heart to stay. I have the peace that passeth understanding down in my heart, down in my heart, down in my heart. I have the peace that passeth understanding down in my heart, down in my heart to stay. You can tell the world, tell every boy and girl that VBS is really fine. You can tell your friends just how great it's been to come together for this joyous time. You can tell your mom and you can tell your pa that VBS is all about God's Word. Tell Uncle Charlie and Aunt Sue about the things you do, from all the Bible stories you have heard. Where you can tell the world and every boy and girl that VBS is really fine. You can tell your friends just how great it's been to come together for this joyous time. And 1, 2, 3, the devil's after me. 4, 5, 6, he's always telling grace. 7, 8, 9, he missed me every time. Hallelujah, hallelujah, I'm free. That verse now. 9, 8, 7, I'm on my way to heaven. 6, 5, 4, the only open door. 3, 2, 1, the devil's on the run. Hallelujah, hallelujah, amen.